Welcome back to the A&A Podcast, where we discuss topics of interest to our audience. We are your hosts.
I am Alexander.
And I am Antonio. And today, Alexander, we have another very special guest joining us.
He's a Capuchin Franciscan of the St. Conrad province, former provincial, doctorate in historical theology. He taught in England, Italy, St. Louis University, and currently he teaches at Oblate School of Theology. He's a spiritual director, formator, and superior of St. Lorenzo de Brindis Friary in San Antonio.
Welcome Father Christopher Popravak.
Well, thank you guys for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Not exactly sure what will be happening as we discuss the topic that you've chosen for today.
Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see what will happen when we start our conversation. But we're very happy that you're joining us, and thank you for saying yes and accompanying us in this podcast. I'm sure it will be an interesting experience for all of us.
For sure.
So today's episode, we will be discussing something that affects us directly. The way we make decisions, the way we act, understanding what is right and wrong.
Our topic for today is the moral law.
Very well. So let's talk about what is the moral law, or what do we understand as the moral law? I think we will have to try and understand where or in what the moral law is based. And the first point that we could discuss is St. Thomas Aquinas' understanding of the natural law. That is, sort of offers a basis for the moral law. And essentially, he defines the moral law as a natural participation in eternal law that is accessible to humans through human reason. And it has one principle that it follows, and that is to do the good and to avoid evil.
This is very theoretical, and we will see during this conversation that we will find another contemporary theologians that they will argue in a different way this concept of moral law. They will say that we have to understand the concept of moral law in more human way. They are trying to say that the human nature is understood dynamically in terms of reasons, of course, like Aquinas say, but as well in self-realization and historical development. So the natural law has to be understood just not with the component of the reason, but as well with experience, the context, culture, and many things.
So let me ask you, you used two terms, moral law and natural law. Are you saying the two are the same?
No. The moral law is based on the natural law. So the moral law will, in order to make laws on the moral level, we have to look at the natural law. And so one of the things that St. Thomas Aquinas says that I found very interesting is that this principle of the first principle of the moral law, to do good and to avoid evil, is absolute and self-evident. But I wonder if this principle of doing good and avoiding evil, it really is self-evident to people. You, Father, you've been a spiritual director. You're a formator even of Capuchin friars. Do you think that it is self-evident for people?
I think people have some innate sense that they are called to do the good and to avoid the evil. Partially, I believe that this is communicated in various cultures. We do have ideals of what is better and what is not so good, but I do think that there is innate within us some kind of sense of what might be right for us to do and what might not be right for us to do.
Yeah, and I think we can bring some concept of the precepts of the natural law, because I think we have to understand what kind of inclination the human being has, because then we will realize that the natural law is very complex. It's not just something that we can get by the reasons or we can get by the will of God, because we have these two characters. We have Saint Bonaventure, that he has more spiritual thought about natural law, but we are focusing now in Thomas Aquinas, that he's saying we have to use the reason, we have to form our conscience, and we have to try to avoid ignorance that we have in our conscience in order to make good decision that is just not applying for us. It has to be applied for everybody. But of course, that's very difficult to understand, because in every culture, in every place, some conceptions are very different. And even through the history of our life, we can see that some concepts change in different ways, like slavery, like the position of some person in the society, and different things. So I think, Antonio, you can explain a little bit what is the first percept about the natural law and the inclination that we have being people.
Right. So St. Thomas Aquinas talks about different precepts, and he says that the first one, and absolute one, is this foundation that is to do the good and to avoid evil. And he mentions that this is something that is essentially innate in us, that no one really teaches it, but it's sort of part of our human makeup. And then there are other precepts that apply to in different levels. So the first one, the order of the precepts would be as a substance. So it's something that humans have in common with all of other substances. And this one is to seek the preservation and the preservation of the self-being. And from this inclination, the right precepts regarding the preservation of human life and the warding off of obstacles. The second inclination is something that humans share with animals. And so this one has to do with inclination towards sexual intercourse, education of offspring, and so forth. So procreation, essentially. And lastly, the inclination as a rational being, which is unique to us as human beings. And this is an inclination to good according to the nature of reason. So this is where, because we are intelligent beings or rational beings, we pursue what is good.
To what extent, though, does culture, but also our own human conditioning, influence our understanding of these goods? For example, our culture might convince us through various media and various means of communication that something which may not be inherently good may be acceptable in a particular culture. How does the notion that there has to be some sense of what's right and what's wrong apply to a situation where the dominant culture is promoting things that are not helpful or good?
Can you give us an example of this?
Well, in contemporary culture right now, this whole notion that people have a right to determine their own gender and to be able to refashion who they are, and that it is almost a given right on the part of the individual to make those kind of choices.
Yes, that's true. I think the natural law that we understand is something that we have to pay attention in these three different kinds of precepts or inclination that Antonio just talked. And always the intention is to preserve the life of the human being, the relationship with others, and the self-environment that we have. Because when somebody understands the natural law with the freedom that we have, we can maybe go further and believe that we can do whatever we want. And that will be a big risk, because, for example, in the same line, just to choosing our gender, we can speak about the divorce and matrimony. That is a big deal for people. They cannot understand sometimes that the divorce is not just a separation between the man and the woman, but it's more about how can you understand this commitment that you have between these two persons. And then if you want to preserve the natural law that we have to go further than just if we are not agree, we just decide that we can separate. So we have to keep in mind these three preservation in order to say what is right and what is wrong.
How do you arrive at what is true? How can you arrive at some judgment as to something is being right or something is not being right?
I will say we will have the main base of this law in the experience that we have through our human life with the laws that we got from God, because we, such as a Christian, we believe that we have the Ten Commandments and another teaching that the church gave us, but we have to put as well the experience and all that happened during the life in order to say, okay, we have all these things in order to say what is good and what is bad.
But I think we also, we have to consider that, yes, as Christians, we take, the teachings of the church and the Ten Commandments, but then we have to consider that not everybody is a Christian. And so how can we apply these precepts or these rules to people who don't take Christianity?
Yeah.
How does that apply to them?
I think the three principles that Antonio mentioned, no? How can we preserve the human being, the future in the sexual relation and the relation with another rational being, saying that these three different spheres can give us the general view that something is good and something is wrong, and not like everybody has the freedom to say, okay, for me it doesn't work or not, because it's a big thing, that universality about the natural law, that we have to have some criteria in order to say, okay, we are doing something good or we are doing something bad.
You think it is truly transcultural?
I will say that we have to consider different things, and the culture is a main thing. No, it's not something that have to influence our decisions, but it's a collection of many things that we have. We, such a human being, we are not just we cannot be influenced by something. We have to form our conscience and understand the natural law like part of ourselves and say, okay, now I can give a correct judgment.
But I think at the end of the day, we are, I guess, essentially made up of our experiences. So we are influenced by many things. And I think of, for example, from a psychological perspective, in developmental psychology, there's the theory of ecosystem by Yuri Bronfenbrenner, where he talks about how there are different ecosystems that the person is surrounded by that affect how the individual thinks. And so one person who is growing up, say, in the same country or in the same neighborhood as you, will think differently than you based on when they were raised, for example. So we can talk about the experience of life that, a child who was in maybe kindergarten or first grade when COVID happened, and how their understanding of education is versus someone who was already working when COVID happened. So their understanding of education or formal education would be very different based on the context, and yet they are from the same sort of cultural context because they're in the same country, they're in the same neighborhood, right? So I think that our cultural and historical context does affect us and affect the way that we think and the way we see things.
But beyond the cultural context that can affect us, there are also psychological factors, as you pointed out, and that people may respond differently because of other characteristics or factors in their environment, which can then incline them toward one point of view rather than another. How do we arrive at some level of certainty? Can we arrive at certainty with regard to issues related to the natural law?
I think the principle that we point at that is absolute is to try to pursue doing good and avoid doing what is evil or what is wrong. Right? So following this precept, then you're shaping your conscience based, or your actions based on that. That am I doing good or am I creating evil?
But that's very controversial because what I might perceive as good, for example, the individual who believes that he really is a woman instead of a man and that he needs to change his gender, he sees that and perceives that as good, whereas someone else might say this is a basic mutilation of the God-given reality this person received.
Right. But then we can say this, is it good, for example, if a man wants to change his gender to a woman because that's how he feels, and looking at the inclinations based on this precept, right? So something that we share with substance, for example, which would be preservation of their own being, is the person self-preserving by cutting his genitals. And then the inclination that we share with animals, which is procreation. Will the person be able to procreate with this? Is the preservation of the species apply here? And then as a rational being, does this make sense? Right? And so those are the parameters that we're setting to establish whether something or not is good or not. Am I doing good or not? Because I could say, yes, well, this feels good to me, but then just because it feels good doesn't mean necessarily that it's good. There are certain parameters that we have to establish.
So your parameters are not just doing good and avoiding evil. You have other parameters beyond that.
Right.
But they have to be based on that. So then because each person, maybe they will have their own opinions, but we have to start with the most basic thing, that is what is the nature of each person. Mm-hmm. We cannot change the things. So we have our immutability in our sense, in our nature, that we are human beings. I am a man, she is a woman, and even if I want to change something, I cannot fight with my own nature. I born with that and I cannot change it.
Yeah, and when we're talking about avoiding evil, we have to, I think we should define what we mean by evil, because it, from a church perspective, I guess if you ask like a pious person what is evil, they would associate it immediately with something that has to do with the devil. From a philosophical perspective, we could say that evil is something, how do I say it? Like St. Augustine describes it as lacking good, something that is missing something good. So one example that St. Thomas Aquinas provides for this is a blind man, right? So the man is good in as much as he is a man, but is evil in as much as he cannot see, because he's missing the sense of sight. And so it's lacking something like goodness in it, because vision is something good and he's lacking that. And so that's why when we're saying do good and avoid evil, we're saying avoid to do things that are lacking goodness in itself.
Yeah, and talking about evil during the history of the church, an idea about what is a pre-moral evil that fight with the moral evil itself is a big discussion. Yeah. Because people understand that the pre-moral evil is the state or the consequence of your action. So like a death is not a sin than murder. So, and the moral evil is the action that the human being does through his freedom. So the first one is a consequence of our actions, and the second one is the action itself. In one case that we can understand better is if somebody has a surgery and the doctor during the treatment make the other person feel some kind of wound. That's not his intention to make this action, but it's through the action of healing that we can say, okay, this person make an evil, or maybe this person make a pre-moral evil. And we have to understand these two different concepts, because we will see during the concept that the moral theology uses, we have to define very well what is something that is objective and what is subjective.
So what are you saying pre-moral evil is in the context of this doctor doing the surgery? What's the pre-moral evil?
So the pre-moral evil essentially is an effect or an action that is not intended. So for example, the example that Alexander gave is he's doing a surgery, so he has to do an incision. An incision will cause pain. The doctor is not intending to cause pain to the patient. The intention of the doctor is to heal something, but he has to create this wound. So That's what he means by pre-moral evil.
So would a case of pre-moral evil exist, for example, in a woman who has an ectopic pregnancy and undergoes surgery to remove the fertilized egg in order to preserve her life? Is that an example of pre-moral evil?
What is the intention of the surgery?
The intention of the surgery is to remove, in this particular case, something that's going to affect negatively her health.
Well, if the intention is to preserve her life, the moral theory will say that she's not committing an act that is morally bad, because we have to consider what is the intention, what is the action, and what is the circumstances in order to say if an act is good or bad. And this is what is very challenging for the perspective that we have at the beginning of the church, when they were very manualistic. Means that we have to follow all the rules of the church, and now we have the new perspective that we have to consider, of course, the teaching of the church, but at the same time the experience of the people and the new knowledge that we can get. Because it's similar with the case if the person kills somebody in auto-defense or self-defense. We know that the killing is bad, but we have to consider the circumstances of this moment in order to say, okay, even when he killed somebody, it was not his intention. The circumstance allowed him to defend himself, and the actions itself was not wrong. So this was the deal, I will say, between these two different times at the church. And this will bring more things that we have to consider just in the perspective of the documents of the church as well. Like a Veritatis Splendor talk, that we have to be very foundational in the teachings of the church, and now Amoris Laetitia will say, okay, we have to consider that, but at the same time we have to be more pastoral. And I will say that the main point is that the laws in any kind of field are good when the people can internalize this law and use by his freedom. Because I can see the debate that we have these two tendencies, just to follow the rules or just give the freedom that the person have. And I think both are very extreme. The recommendation that the contemporary theologians say is we have to give the law to the people in order to humanize his life and act in good way.
Could our perceptions of what is to be done, the good that to be done and the evil to be avoided, can it grow over time? Can our perceptions change about the morality of particular issues?
Yes.
Give me some examples.
Well, we can talk, for example, about
Slavery.
yes, that's exactly what I was going to talk about. We can talk about slavery through history, right? We talk about Saint Paul, for example, writes about how the slave should be. I forget the words exactly, but essentially submissive to or respectful to their masters, and the masters should be kind to the slaves. And then many centuries later, we think in the United States, for example, which is a country that is known for having slaves, and there was no recognition of the dignity of people, and there was a lot of debates whether or not they were even people, right? And so as we move through history, we've seen that there's a recognition of we were wrong by our actions, and we recognize the dignity of these people, right? We can see it even in the way that women have been treated through the ages, to where have seen as less than or only as property of a man, or in relation to their value was determined by the relation to a man, to a point where now women are in many countries are given the same value and dignity as a man, right? The same rights as a man. And so this shows how the evolution or our understanding of history helps us shape our understanding of morality and the actions that we that we choose, the laws that we make, essentially.
I'm so glad that Antonio brought these examples, because have very relation with the last invitation of the contemporary theologians, that we have to re-evaluate the formulations of many moral norms, because we saw that the understandings of some laws in the time of Jesus were very restricted in different things, and some of them make bad things. But when Jesus came and brought the perfect law, he didn't change anything. He perfected the law that the people at this time they had. So part of the contribution of the new theologians say that we have to be less negative and more positive with the precepts, because this is a tendency that we used to have in our society. And then we have to try to avoid the tendency to be so descriptive and try to use a better moral language, because like we mentioned in the case of this doctor, it's not the same to say I kill somebody and made some kind of murder to the person. So we have to, in this time, be more flexible, but in the same time trying to understand that there are many factors when we talk about natural law. And the last thing maybe I will say is that not all the laws have the same applicability or exception, because each case is very particular. We cannot have just one measure for all the cases, and this is the invitation of the moral theology now, that we have to consider the basic truths of the church, but we have to consider the different aspects that we mentioned in order to say an act is good or bad, and then we can make a judgment. And of course, like the invitation of Pope Francis in Amoris Laetitia, we have to be very compassionate with the people. But of course, we have to have at least very clear the basic laws that we believe.
Yeah, and I mean, you were talking about how we need to be careful in how we look at every case, right? Because it's different. There's many elements that come into it. And I think this is touching on the idea of discernment, which we were talking about in the previous episode, to be able to look at a situation and understand that the principles that I may apply at the situation and consider it as something wrong cannot be the same principles that apply to a different situation. But what would be something, how can a person form their conscience in a way that can help them discern between two situations that may appear to be the same, but the context may be different? How do you think, Father, that, I mean, what would be some tips that you would give someone to form their conscience as a minister, or someone that you've encountered on spiritual direction?
Well, the question then I would throw back at you, to what degree can the church's teachings help educate a person and have them form a conscience in a proper sense? Is the church a source of conscience formation, or do we see the church's teachings as having been too restrictive? What is your view?
I would say that the church gave us a good instruction about what Jesus' invitation was when he came. And he never imposed anything to his disciple. But we have to be very aware that if we want to follow his paths, we have to follow these instructions, not in order to become something legalistic, but in order to try to get his promise. And of course, when we talk about laws, many of us, we can feel disagree with some of that, but in the main reason that God's law never will be against us. Always will be give us the happiness that we want to have. So the teachings of the church goes with the same purpose that God had at the beginning. Make a happy people and try to respect with all our neighbors.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today. Looking at, beginning with the moral law with Thomas Aquinas, and then seeing how contemporary theologians also apply this in a more contemporary context, perhaps. And so I guess one question that we can leave to our audience is, do you think that the moral law is something that is self-evident, as we were saying at the beginning of the episode? Do you think it is self-evident for every individual? And how much do you think that the cultural and historical context in which we live help us shape our conscience as we move through this world, especially as divided as it seems to be today? So, Father Christopher, we want to thank you once again for being part of our podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure. And for you at home, we'll see you on the next episode of the A&A Podcast. We are your hosts again. I am Antonio.
And I am Alexander.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you, guys.